Good morning and good afternoon. It's David Balin and Stephen Whiting, and we're here with today's guest, Tom Wright. He is the Brookings Senior Fellow for Strategy and Technology at the Brookings Institute. And from April of 22 till January of 25, he was the Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the U.S. National Security Council. And we're here to talk with Tom today to understand exactly what's going on in Iran at this precise moment and the implications for it economically, politically, and militarily as we look out over the next 6 to 12 months. Tom, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So right now, the U.S. has actually instituted its own blockade in Iran. Most of us don't understand specifically what that blockade is designed to do and whether or not the Straits of Hormuz are actually open right now for commerce. Why don't you give us an update as to where we are right now?
Yeah, so it might be just worth zooming out for 1 second, just I think to understand how we got to this point. The war, of course, started on February 28th. President Trump, I think, imagined, he certainly told senior diplomats in Washington, D.C., that it would last less than a week. Publicly, he said more 4 to 5 weeks, but I think they were hopeful with the knockout blow at the beginning that they could strike a deal with another person inside the regime, like the Delcy Rodriguez, model from Venezuela, and maybe cut the U.S. in on some of the oil and have an agreement on nuclear and missiles, and they can move forward. Obviously, it turned out very different to that. We can get into that in a few minutes if you're, interested. But essentially, the U.S. and Israel were able to achieve a lot of tactical gains on the battlefield by destroying a lot of Iran's military capacity. But for its part, Iran was able to do two things that gave it significant leverage. It was effectively able to control the Strait of Hormuz and allow its ships out, but block all Western or alliance ships from leaving. And the second thing was it was able to sustain an attack on countries in the region, including on Israel, but also, I think, even more importantly, on the Gulf states, on the UAE in particular, but also Saudi Arabia and others. And then by the end, when we ultimately got a ceasefire, I think what we saw was that the president was deeply frustrated that they weren't crying uncle and essentially capitulating. And he sort of said that, publicly. So then we had this rather dramatic day where he threatened to destroy a civilization, by which we think he meant destroying energy infrastructure in Iran. Of course, they retained the capacity to retaliate and destroy energy infrastructure and water infrastructure, in the region, which I think could have really worsened the energy crisis and also really caused a spiral in the war itself. They then agreed to a ceasefire. I think that ceasefire, from my point of view, was never likely to result in a deal because when you look at the two sides, their demands are so incompatible. The U.S. and Iran both had maximalist demands, the 15-point plan and the 10-point plan, and those talks didn't go well. And I think the reason they didn't go well is each side believed sincerely that they had won the war, and they couldn't really understand why the other side wasn't, meeting them more than halfway. When the talks broke down, I think then the U.S. had a choice: return to the war, where all of those old dilemmas would reemerge, and President Trump would still have the challenges about how to win without a massive escalation, whether that's attacks on energy infrastructure or on ground operations, which comes at its own risk. So he decided not to do that, and I think by default he ended up in a blockade. And the thinking there was that if the U.S. can deprive Iran of its energy revenue over the long term, that it won't be able to function. I think that misreads, the Iranian regime, which has endured a lot and I think is willing to endure a lot because it sees this as an existential conflict from its perspective. But that's essentially where we are. And I think the way to think about this is which sort of breaks first. Is it Iran because it can't sort of function and so it capitulates to US demands, or is it sort of the US, because of long term pressure on sort of the price of energy, which maybe isn't fully reflected in the markets to date? But imagine if this went on for 6 months. For instance, then would he either go back to the conflict and escalate, or would he compromise and essentially accept many of Iran's key demands?
I'm curious as to whether or not you think that it was a reasonable prospect that there could have been regime change, given what you just said.
I think it's, I think if you knew that the upper echelons of the regime would be taken out in the first hour, that it was not sort of unreasonable to think that it's possible that the regime, could have collapsed. But I think one also needs to remember that the regime was sort of planning for this eventuality, for decapitation strikes. They had essentially devolved responsibility. They basically have a monopoly on the use of violence inside Iran. So there was never really any likelihood, I think, of people, taking to the streets, no sort of alternative center of power. And critically, I think if you want a regime change or a coup, you basically need a fracturing of the regime's elite. And I think the minute that Mishaba Hamani was confirmed to have survived and he was appointed the supreme leader, that sort of filled that vacuum nationally. So that meant there was less likely to be high level defections. But we obviously don't know because it's sort of classified. But I suspect in Venezuela we had those high level regime defections, which allowed for the raid of Maduro. We did not see that in Iran. So I think once the first few days had passed, I think the regime had effectively consolidated. And, one of the reasons they did not really escalate massively last June or in 2024 on the two occasions where they launched strikes on Israel and we helped Israel defend itself, was because they were worried that the US had escalation dominance and could take the war to places that would be very uncomfortable for them. By launching an all-out conflict here, Trump didn't leave anything on the table. So I think they had no reason not to go all out themselves, which they did with the regional strikes, and the Strait of Hormuz, which seems to have caught the administration off guard to some extent. That actually succeeded beyond their expectations.
Yeah.
So I think the regime will come out of this feeling that they have withstood sort of an unprecedented assault, and they have confirmed and discovered additional geopolitical leverage that may be even more, consequential and significant than they believed before this started.
Can I ask, Tom, if we just take this from this moment further? There's a blockade of the Straits of the Hormuz from the US side and from the Iranian side. And it seems now that Iranian crude oil is not going to be able to be exported through the Straits of Hormuz. Obviously, there is a China factor in that, as they are the customer on the side. But if there were a ground invasion of Karg Island and somehow that prevented any oil revenue from coming in, this is doing the same thing. If we were to hold this forward, do you think that this increases the chances of more Iranian tax on neighbors, on the pipelines in Saudi Arabia that are allowing all of that crude oil out through the Red Sea? How do you think that this, if we were to hold this status quo now, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, so I think, have about, 5 or 6 days of the ceasefire left. So I don't expect that will, it might break before then. But if we assume that continues, I think at a point then the question is if that is extended or not. I think the Iranians will be worried about a indefinite arrangement where they have no revenue, and if the US seems to be absorbing that political pressure in a reasonable, in a reasonable way, I don't think that they will let that slide, right? I think they will do something to sort of remind the world and America, and the Gulf, that this is too painful for us, vis-a-vis painful for them. And so I think we could see some real effort to up the sort of pain on the West and on the Gulf. That may be a tax. I think if they do that, obviously they'd be running the risk of, US retaliatory attacks. But I think what we have learned is that the regime is not only resilient, it's deeply committed to its red lines, and it is not going to agree, I believe, to a verifiable inspection regime on its missile program. It's not going to give up all of the leverage it has in the Strait of Hormuz. It may or may not agree to some compromise on the nuclear side, but I think that they will stick to those red lines basically until they break. I don't think this regime is going to is going to just capitulate at the negotiating table, and I don't think they're going to allow themselves to be the proverbial frog that is boiled over time. So I agree with your premise. I think they will. I think this is why this is a very unstable equilibrium, because each side is not just going to let the other run its play, and to neuter it over the medium to long term. They will take short term actions to disrupt that. So it will be sort of an unstable, volatile situation, even if the peace lasts, which it may not, but even if it were to last through the summer.
Should we assume that the U.S. is planning some way to open the Straits of Hormuz by force, right? That the internal countries like the UAE, terribly negatively affected by this, it's really going to be a escalating problem for Europe, the lack of Qatari gas, that sort of thing. Is there really the expectation that all of those speedboats have to be taken out, that there's something has to happen to take out the mines, that's probably what we will do next, or will we let it stay this way?
I think the military option is very difficult. I think it's difficult in general, but it's also difficult because of technological sort of advances. So just if we set aside the technological advances, their model is basically to use some of the coastal areas to harass and threaten ships that it does not want to go through. That results in obviously insurance companies pulling the insurance. These tankers and others are risk averse. So then they basically self-select not to test it and not to try to go through. So to really neuter that, you would need to take those coastal areas and remove any Iranian military presence. It's not just sort of mines, which I think it's unclear whether they have used many of those or not. It seems like they have not really relied on those, and they're not even, I think, relying on sort of boats or their own sort of vessels. So it's really the proximity of these, of missiles and drones and the like. The second thing I would say on the technological advances, one thing we learned in Ukraine, which I spent sort of a lot of time on when I was at the NSC, is, Ukraine was able to deny Russia the use of the Black Sea, basically deny their fleet, which is vast and strong, from using it because of their deployment of undersea drones and UBSs and other sort of weapons that they developed in real time, and the distance from where Iran is, from where Ukraine is launching some of those, and Sevastopol is greater than the distance across the Strait of Hormuz, and Russia never figured that out. An answer to that, I think, that is not because they're not sort of smart enough. I think it's just an incredibly effective technology. And of course, we have this alliance effectively, or certainly partnership between Iran and Russia, and Iran learned a lot from the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think there's that dimension too. So I think this is when President Trump says this is effectively open except for the odd missile or mine, or Europe could open this tomorrow, I think he is massively sort of understating just the military problem from being able to do this. So I don't, I would stand open to correction from, naval officers and others who would, who may have more direct experience in it. But my sort of sense is that basically this is probably not impossible, but very, very difficult to open without a diplomatic agreement with Iran. And I think they understand that. And they are not going to agree to a diplomatic deal that just simply reopens it like it is before. Even their agreement to the ceasefire was, we want this to be in coordination. It needs to be in coordination with the IRGC. They then said, there will be some cost applied. I think they will try to really formalize that, in any agreement. And this is why the UAE and the Gulf states, I think, do not actually want this war to end, because they sort of understand that with this regime in power and with this leverage, that their economic reality has a maritime reality has fundamentally changed. And I think
Right.
they want to see the United States stick at this to basically ultimately, defeat the Iranian regime completely and no more of attrition.
Right. That seems to be the largest unintended consequence, right? Which is this idea that, what it was before, right, could have gotten worse and be sustainably worse, to your point right there. I'm very curious as to your impressions of how this changes the relationship between, the Gulf states, between them and the U.S., between them, the U.S. and Israel. Because with that dynamic change, with the change in the economy, right, the very way it operates, and with the fact that there's been so much damage to infrastructure by drones and other relatively inexpensive technology, that relationship, even the need for security now, has changed. So I would love to get your impression of what it means for the Middle East and the relationship between those groups.
Yeah, I think it's complicated, right? I think on the one hand, they're deeply frustrated with the United States because this war started. There was no plan really on the Strait of Hormuz. They didn't really get a say in whether the war ended or not. Their view was once this started, it was important to see it through to its finish, from their own strategic perspective. And so, on the one hand, you could say it dramatically weakens the alliance relationship with America. On the other hand, if the regime stays in place, the Iranian regime stays in place and continues to be a threat to those countries, particularly the UAE, and they've basically used almost all of their air defense interceptors, their Patriot missiles and the like, which I think they have, and they need to rebuild those over time, and they're not in vast supply. So it's not just a matter of money, it will take some time. And they worry about the Strait of Hormuz. I think that sort of acts in the opposite direction, that even though they may be deeply frustrated in Washington, they basically have nowhere else to go, right? They need a strong military relationship with the US and with others. With others is interesting because China and Russia have really, in an indirect way, put their lot in with Iran, right? So they won't really be able to trust them. So I think they are moving towards Ukraine, which is interesting and I think welcome, given Ukraine's expertise. But basically, I guess I think that despite their frustration, they will probably end up being, continue to be tied closely to the U.S. out of pure geopolitical necessity. I'm sure MBZ and others, leader of the UAE, I know he will be probably furious, privately, and will tell people that. But I don't think it will lead to a breaking of the U.S. alliance system in the region for the moment. Maybe once this settles down.
Before, I guess it was, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, it was possible that Israel was going to come to terms with, some security terms with a number of these countries and reopen diplomatic relations. Of course, the October 7th events took place. Where does their relationship with the Middle East stand now?
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of work on the Saudi Israel US deal in the Biden administration. I think we were actually quite close. It was difficult, but I think we were getting closer. It was all sort of arranged between the US and Saudi Arabia. The tricky part was what Israel was willing to give as part of that agreement. And then October 7th happened. And I personally believe that one of the reasons for October 7th was Hamas wanted to blow up all of this
Sure.
prospective progress in the region and regional integration and create a fire so big it consumed everything else. And I think to some extent, they succeeded in that goal, right? Because the conflict and fire and tragedy that resulted from that day and beyond was so vast that it made a lot of diplomatic progress in the region extremely fraught and extremely difficult, and we're in a more revolutionary period now. And I think it's unlikely, that that will be able to be restarted. Certainly under present Israeli leadership, but I think
Right.
until sort of the wars post October 7th settle down and are sort of resolved, and there is more of a stable and relatively progressive arrangement, with the Palestinians. I think until that happens, the Saudis, MBS, won't feel able to dive in, and that's not because I think he cares fundamentally more than his narrow strategic interests about the Palestinian question, but I think he's his own domestic audiences, and he's made it clear, that there needs to be more progress there from his point of view. So I think that that will remain fairly stagnant. I think on the UAE Israel side, I think that probably will remain relatively stable for the moment. But I think there is a little bit more concern prior to this war. There was a little bit more concern about some of the instability resulting from Netanyahu's decisions. In addition to the sort of Iran threat, this will probably revitalize the salience of the Iran threat because, of course, all those countries have been attacked by Iran, so that will push them a little bit closer
Right.
to Israel. But I guess the short answer is probably not a huge amount of change in those relationships for the moment.
Two further questions. One of the most, and one about the Ukraine and one about China. It's fascinating how Ukraine's ability to build its own weaponry, develop its own technology, to basically become ultimately to be able to withstand an attack, right, from one of the three largest powers in the world, right, has changed, and then of course the U.S. abandonment of them, right, for a time at least, is also important. I'm very curious as to now how with this. With what's happened in the Middle East and with the fact that the Ukrainians could in fact become really important suppliers, right, of technology and experience to these Middle Eastern countries, whether or not that will change the dynamic for Ukraine in Europe and in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, I remember in 2022, we often had arguments with the Ukrainians because they would use Patriot missiles, interceptors, too quickly and too frequently against drone attacks or the like. So they might use a missile worth millions, millions of dollars for a $20,000 drone. And eventually they figured out how not to do that and be more efficient in using electronic warfare and other counter drone technologies to bring down the Russian attacks and only preserve the Patriots for ballistic missiles. What was really interesting was that in this war, they were the ones saying to the Gulf, you're using these inefficiently, you're making all the mistakes that they made in 2022 and advising them how to do it more smartly. And of course, unfortunately, the US government had not really learned from our own experience in Ukraine. So, President Trump, had he not been, I think, so hostile to Ukraine in advance of the war, could have asked Zelensky to pre-position Ukrainian advisors in each of the Gulf states to coach them to how to do an effective air defense against drones. Like there was no reason why that couldn't have happened, but he
Right.
didn't. And so there was a real problem there. Just to give you some numbers, Ukraine uses on average 60 Patriot missiles interceptors a month. In the first 5 days of the war, I think the Gulf states used over 900. We produce about 600 a year, and it's very, very hard to increase that production number. So there's a real issue. So I think they have a very important role to play. I think it's primarily on the advice and technical side rather than just giving some of this. I think the Gulf states can help build it themselves, but they need training and coaching for the infrastructure to how to implement this. I think the way it changes the war, it probably doesn't change the war in Europe fundamentally. but it gives the Gulf states a self-interest in Ukraine's survival, right? I mean, if Ukraine doesn't survive, then they do not actually have, a partnership with them going forward. And so I think it gives them a stake in Ukraine. And they also know that the Russian and Chinese assistance to Iran is probably greater than is widely understood. And that will ultimately, the Russians try to have it all ways and try to work with the Gulf states as well as with Iran. But I think they will know that actually net nets out negatively for them, for the Gulf states. So I think it is interesting. I think Zelensky is smart. He will try to do strategic deals that result in more revenue, maybe more, assistance. He was hoping initially for Patriots in exchange for counter drone tech. He's not going to get that, I think, because they've used all of their Patriots or are using them, but he may get other things. So I think it's a positive development for Ukraine.
And I'm curious as to your view of how China could have played this differently. It seems to me that, that with obviously, the alliance between Iran and China and Russia, that's interesting. But the Chinese, in fact, have gotten very little out of this, right? And could have played a different role in the resolution of the war, and still can. But they've chosen not to do anything, seems like.
Yeah, I mean, they've been helping indirectly Iran. There's a couple of different Chinese satellite companies that have been providing real-time imagery. The Financial Times had a big story on this yesterday. Previously, there was a company called Mizar Vision that was selling that imagery. It also has been reported in the press that they're selling air defenses to Iran. They will want to be very quiet about this, right? Their MO is to basically do this secretly, to deny it, not to. That's how they worked with the Russians. So they won't sort of talk about this that much. But I think it is significant that they do seem to be, helping Iran survive, against, the U.S. and Israeli attacks. In terms of how it's net it out for them so far, they have been able to continue to get oil from the strait until this past week. I think they will be in a decent position on reconstruction in the region just because of their capacity. I think it also could bog the U.S. down in the Middle East for some time. Our inventory of not just air defense, but also long range strike missiles like the Tomahawk have been massively depleted, which I think is good news for them. So I don't think they like the instability. I think they would prefer it to be over. But I think it's a mixed picture for them. And there's some, attractive elements to this from a Chinese strategic perspective.
Great. Well, we very much appreciate your being with us. I'm going to just ask you to close with this. If you had to think 6 months from now, right? And again, recognizing that there are many outcomes, but if you had a picture where this conflict would be 6 months from now, what state would it be in?
It's a great question. And I think, obviously I don't know, but if I give you my best guess, I mean, I think if you looked at the situation in early 2025, you would have said it's highly likely that President Trump will strike a deal with Iran because he'd made that very clear. He sent Steve Witkoff. The Israelis were quite worried. And then, of course, the June war happened. And if you ask anyone, including me, after the June war, where we'd be this year, I think I would have said certainly President Trump thinks he's solved this. It may not be solved. I'm hearing it's more complicated, but he will claim it's a big victory and he will never sort of touch it again through the duration of he'll take the win and he'll ignore it, right? And then we end up in this even larger conflict today. So I think, the markets, and I think in general, a lot of governments tend to think, there will be some type of diplomatic deal because President Trump doesn't want to go back to the war now because he feels, like the escalation ground troops could result in a much more protracted thing that would hurt him politically, and energy infrastructure attacks could cause a real and protracted spike in the price of oil, but also shortages of fertilizer, chemicals, real problems in supply chains and all of that. So we're assuming that they will, do a deal. But what worries me is that the two sides have goals that are so incompatible. And I think the Iranian regime is even more radical and hardline than its predecessor, which was very radical and hardline. That I guess I would have to sort of expect that this will be continuing in some in some form. That may be, an actual war with ground troops. I think that's probably unlikely, but I think it's certainly not impossible. There are forces in the region. They've been building up those options. If they try one of them, which would be an attempt for a quick tactical win, and it doesn't work, that could cause them to send more troops in to sort of, to try to reverse the problem. It could be the infrastructure attacks, which he has promised before. Or if it's not a war, it could be a protracted mutual sort of blockade of sorts with sporadic sort of actions by each side, including the Iranians, to really up the cost. And so, I would think that this is, base case for me. These tensions are likely to continue and even worsen, and it will be quite sort of unstable with ever-present possibility of sort of crises going through the rest of this year.
Thomas Wright of the Brookings Institute, thank you very much for spending time with me and Stephen Whiting at The Point, and we're very much looking forward to having you back, hopefully in more peaceful times in a month or two. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.